Hello everyone! I've got another Jane Eyre adaptation comparison for you. A very late Jane Eyre adaptation comparison. I am so sorry. I was working on this back in the middle of November with every intention of getting Jane back to Thornfield before the end of the year. And then it didn't happen. So let's dive right into it. Today we're dealing with Jane's return to Gateshead, which lasts through the second part of chapter 21 and the first part of chapter 22. When we left off, 2.5 months ago, Jane had been summoned to see her sick aunt, Mrs. Reed, at Gateshead, where she lived for the first 10 years of her life. When she arrives, she's first reunited with her cousins Eliza and Georgiana, who she barely recognizes. They're about as friendly and polite to Jane as you would expect, but she takes it in stride. Her first reunion with Mrs. Reed prompts a lot of memories, most of them bad, but given the terms of their separation, Jane's attitude as an adult is surprising. Well did I remember Mrs. Reed's face, and I eagerly sought the familiar image. It is a happy thing that time quells the longings of vengeance and hushes the promptings of rage and aversion. I had left this woman in bitterness and hate, and I came back to her now with no other emotion than a sort of ruth for her great sufferings, and a strong yearning to forget and forgive all injuries, to be reconciled and clasp hands in amity. Jane approaches her aunt with a spirit of forgiveness, ready to forget the past and move on, but she gets a cold reception. I had once vowed that I would never call her aunt again. I thought it no sin to forget and break that vow now. My fingers had fastened on her hand, which lay outside the sheet. Had she pressed mine kindly, I should at that moment have experienced true pleasure. But unimpressionable natures are not so soon softened, nor are natural antipathies so readily eradicated. Mrs. Reed took her hand away, and turning her face rather from me, she remarked that the night was warm. Again she regarded me so icily, I felt at once that her opinion of me, her feeling towards me, was unchanged and unchangeable. I knew by her stony eye, opaque to tenderness, indissoluble to tears, that she was resolved to consider me bad to the last, because to believe me good would give her no generous pleasure, only a sense of mortification. Mrs. Reed launches into a caustic rant, talking about Jane in the third person, and saying how much she hated her and why. In her delirium, she suddenly switches to talking about her son John. She's overcome with emotions and has to be sedated. Jane must wait several days for another interview, during which time she gets to know her cousins better. Eliza is severe and strictly disciplined, while Georgiana is vain and self-obsessed. They hate each other, and show a disturbing lack of concern for their dying mother. When Jane is able to see her aunt again, Mrs. Reed confesses to two things. First, that she broke her promise to her husband to take care of Jane, and second, that 3 years ago, when Jane's uncle John Eyre wrote to Mrs. Reed and asked about Jane's whereabouts and expressed his wish to adopt Jane, she wrote back that Jane had died at Lowood. This is Mrs. Reed's deathbed confession, but she is far from repentant. She blames Jane for making her lie, and rebuffs Jane's attempts to reach out to her. Still, Jane tells her that she has her full and free forgiveness. Mrs. Reed dies that night. Jane agrees to stay on at Gateshead a couple weeks more at her cousin's request. Finally, once everything's taken care of and they say they don't need her anymore, she is free to return to Thornfield. I think this section is significant for a few reasons. It introduces Jane's uncle and his desire to get in touch with her and make her his heir, which comes up again later. It ties up a loose end with Jane and her aunt. It shows how far Jane's come and how much she's matured. She's a young woman now with confidence and a strong moral character, able to handle an undesirable, hostile situation gently and calmly. And it deals with one of the dominant messages of Charlotte Bronte's novel, forgiveness. Here Jane gets her first big chance to demonstrate that she's taken her friend Helen's lessons about forgiveness and humility and turning the other cheek to heart. Forgiveness is usually not something that comes easily, and forgiveness of our enemies, those who have done us wrong, does not come naturally. But even though Mrs. Reed did not ask for it and did not deserve it, Jane bestows it freely. And her willingness here to forgive Mrs. Reed, I think, is a precursor to her willingness later on in the story to forgive someone else who hurts her with a lie. I'm being purposely evasive here. I know that I do have people watching who don't know the full story. Now, the adaptations are all over the place with this section. Some of them place as much emphasis on it as I think they should, others spend less time on it. A few of them don't have it at all. To me, that's a mistake. I really feel that Jane's persistent expression of forgiveness of her aunt, who was so cruel to her, is something that needs to be included. So to the versions that skip it, 1934, 1970, and 1997, what are you doing? As for the ones that do have it, there are a few specific things I look for. Number one, I want an adaptation to convey that going back to Gateshead is a big deal for Jane. It doesn't have to be intense, I just want to get a sense that it's a challenge for her to return to this house that was the source of so much unhappiness. Number two, sincerity. I have to believe that Jane really does forgive her aunt and genuinely desires at least one drop of kindness or love from her. The scene is marred for me if Jane says she forgives her aunt, but doesn't seem to mean it. Number three, a little character development of the cousins is a nice touch. It's not so important to me that an adaptation flesh them out and follow the book to a T here, but I want to see something, since the book does say quite a bit about them. Now, let's actually talk about the adaptations. 1934 doesn't have this scene, as I said, so we'll skip over that and go straight to 1943, 1944, which is very different in the way it handles this section. From a practical perspective, I get it. The point when Jane is supposed to go back to Gateshead occurs about 70 minutes into a movie that's only 96 minutes long. If they had placed the scene in its usual position, then the events that occur after Jane's return to Thornfield would have been insanely rushed, unless they just made the movie longer, which, why didn't they? So instead, they moved the scene with sick Mrs. Reed forward to an empty slot where Jane would have stayed with the Rivers family, which kind of helps with the timing of everything and condensing the story, but it's strange. And what I don't like about this whole sequence in this movie, and I will probably not touch on all of that here, is that the script makes Jane do some things I don't think she would do. One thing that I'll say is that Jane isn't sent for here. After fleeing Thornfield, she goes back to Gateshead voluntarily to see Bessie. I can't see her doing that. Wanting to see Bessie, yes. Going back to Gateshead, no. Upon her arrival, she's surprised to find her cousin John is dead and her aunt is sick. A delirious Mrs. Reed pleads for Jane not to leave her, so Jane stays by her bed until she dies. That's fine, but during that period, Jane receives a visit from Dr. Rivers, and that whole thing is different, and then the scene afterward is different, but since all of that deals with stuff that happens later in the book, I'll save that for a future discussion. They have time for all this extra stuff, but there's nothing about her uncle's letter, and no word of forgiveness, so, I do like this version, but it lets me down here. The 1970 version doesn't include this scene, and doesn't have Jane's aunt at all, so on to 1973. This version goes right into it with a lengthy monologue from Mrs. Reed. She seems slightly less sickly than the others. She's able to sit up, her speech is relatively clear, and she looks a little more put together, though aside from one fidgety hand, she's immobile. Her thoughts wander, and she struggles to recognize Jane, but she isn't so ill that she can't vehemently express her hatred and disgust for the child she feels was born to torment her. Mrs. Reed is unrepentant to the last. She practically gloats as Jane reads her uncle's letter and realizes what she did, and is repulsed when Jane leans in too enthusiastically for a kiss. This Jane is so warm and friendly that it's like watching a puppy get kicked by its owner to see her rejected like that. Only at the very end does Mrs. Reed start to show fear and desperation. The scene draws to a close as Jane watches over her aunt's body, and that's the 73 version's surprisingly short rendition of that sequence. It's just the one scene, the two interviews with the aunt rolled into one, and nothing from the cousins. I don't mind that. The only thing I miss is Jane telling her aunt she forgives her. It surprises me that they left that line out. On to 1983, which takes more time with the section. Jane is first reunited with her cousins. She seems amused by their cold reception, which reflects more poorly on them than on her. Her politeness is almost defiant in the face of their childish snobbery, and I like her good humor here. She sees the absurdity in it. Some of you might remember that when I did my adaptation comparison of the scenes of Jane's childhood at Gateshead, I realized how much I preferred Judy Cornwell's performance as Mrs. Reed, and so I was curious to see if that preference would extend to this scene as well, And it does. Mrs. Reed here is very sickly. She's breathless, her mouth is dry, she can't move, she's paranoid, wants to be sure they're alone in the room, and afraid of death, of her own guilt, but especially terrified of Jane. She's so unwell, I'm not even sure that she's clearly seeing Jane as a grown woman. She might just see the same angry 10-year-old child who left her speechless 8 years ago. She's so humiliated by the prospect of confessing about the letter that she tries to talk herself out of it. It's a pitiful thing. Not that you really feel sorry for this woman, but she's held prisoner by her own hatred and fear. She could be free and die at peace. Jane is more than willing to reconcile and facilitate that, but Mrs. Reed is too spiteful and stubborn. As in 1973, the two interviews are combined into one, and I really like the acting here. Jane is hurt by Mrs. Reed's continued, fervent rejection, and naturally she gets a little frustrated. She asks for forgiveness and doesn't receive it, and then she offers it, not so much out of compassion for her aunt, it seems, but more because she knows she has a moral obligation to forgive her, and she will do it, whether either of them likes it or not. I can't fault her for not expressing it joyfully. It's not pleasant to be abused and maligned and to just stand there and take it. That Jane stays as calm as she does is to her credit, and something I've always admired about her in this moment. And in this case, even if there is an edge to her delivery, I do think that deep down her forgiveness is sincere. Even so, Mrs. Reed loses consciousness and apparently never hears her words. The sequence ends with a brief scene of the three cousins and Bessie standing around her deathbed. Georgiana is slightly more developed than Eliza, but this version never does dwell on the antagonism between the two sisters. It devotes its attention in the segment to Jane and her aunt, which is fine. On to the 1996 version, which, like 1944, also jumbles up the story a bit. Jane is greeted at Gateshead by St. John Rivers. What? Who introduces himself as the rector of Gateshead, informs her of her cousin's death, introduces his sister Mary, and takes Jane to see her aunt. Well, that's one way to fast-track the story, establishing St. John Rivers as a character much sooner, so he won't be such a stranger when we meet him again. St. John Rivers is played by Samuel West, the third supporting actor in this movie who also had a significant role in the 1995 version of Persuasion, the other two being Fiona Shaw, Mrs. Reed, and Amanda Root, Miss Temple. Anyway, Mrs. Reed seems a little startled to see Jane at first, but she wastes no time getting to the point, as this version has less time to spare than some others. She doesn't speak to Jane with as much dislike, perhaps because she doesn't have the energy for it. There's a difference with her confession in this version. Instead of falsely reporting that Jane was dead, Mrs. Reed told the uncle that she knew nothing about Jane Eyre. I'm not sure if that's better or worse. Better, maybe. Then he could have at least tried tracking her down some other way, whereas if he thought she was dead, well, not that it makes a whole lot of difference. Either way, Mrs. Reed lied. In this version, it stuck out to me that the letter, which is 3 years old, remember, is kept at the top of the pile in Mrs. Reed's writing case, which implies it's something she's kept nearby and looked over fairly often. I like how Jane's bestowal of forgiveness is remarkably gentle, even after Mrs. Reed pulls her hand away from her touch. The St. John Rivers thing is a little odd, but in this scene at least, it's such an unobtrusive change that it's not really a problem. Just the screenwriters playing Tetris with the story again to try to squeeze it into feature-length runtime. Otherwise, the scene's alright. The 1997 adaptation passes over this section completely, except that it doesn't. It has all the build-up for it, Bessie's visit to Thornfield, breaking the news about Jane's family, Jane's dramatic departure, and then, in the very next scene, she's back! I already feel that cutting out this part of the book is the wrong decision, and it's an even more glaring omission here than in 1934 or in 1970, because it's so obviously supposed to be here. It leads up to it, and then there's nothing, and it's just her coming back and talking about what happened, and that's not good enough. In film, you don't tell, you show. It's like one of the cardinal rules of screenwriting, and unlike in those films in 1934 or in 1970, significant time was spent here on Jane's childhood and on showing her tumultuous relationship with her aunt. Not as much time as in some of the longer versions, of course, but they should have spared a few minutes here, just a couple of minutes, to go back to Gateshead and address that. Anyway, rant over, on to the 2006 adaptation. As Jane walks through the house, she relives the harrowing experiences of her childhood in a cluster of flashbacks. She then meets her cousins, and they are such pills! The two sourest people on the planet right there. Jane is finally brought to her aunt, who doesn't recognize her but still pulls her hand away when Jane touches it. This is the only adaptation in which Jane has two separate scenes with her aunt, as in the book. In the first, they talk about Jane in the third person, and Mrs. Reed reveals that she hated Jane so much because she hated her mother, her husband's favorite sister, and she despised the way her husband doted on Jane as a baby, favoring her over his own children. Which isn't the right thing for a parent to do, but I can't say I blame him, having seen Mrs. Reed's kids. Then she shifts to talking about her son John and starts screaming for him, which I always find startling, even when I know it's coming. We then have a scene of Jane and Bessie talking, in which Jane talks about her friend Mr. Rochester, but not in a way that would be improper, thanks to Jane's grammatically incorrect usage of the third-person plural they instead of the third-person singular he. Then we jump back to Thornfield for a scene or two with Rochester's guests, followed by a scene of the three cousins at Gateshead passing time. This scene, where Jane sits sketching Rochester from memory, comes from the book, and this is the only version to include Eliza's monologue in which she harshly criticizes her sister Georgiana and basically disowns her, which is super awkward for Jane. They're both awful. That's followed by the second visit with Aunt Reed, where she's more cogent and tells Jane about the letter. Poor Jane actually smiles a little at first as she reads at the thought of her uncle wanting not just to see her, but to adopt her. It's striking how resonant and raspy Tara Fitzgerald's already deep voice sounds here. Rather than getting worked up, Mrs. Reed tells the story matter-of-factly, almost apathetically. She's dying, her son's gone, she doesn't care about anything anymore. Although I do think, with this Mrs. Reed being particularly sadistic, she gets one last bit of enjoyment from the look on Jane's face when she realizes what's been taken from her. I'm going to give Ruth Wilson's Jane the prize for sincerest expression of forgiveness. After learning what her aunt did, she helps her drink some water, then sits with her, touches her hand, says she forgives her, and kisses her on the forehead. There's no touch of resentment or reluctance about any of it. And lastly, on to the 2011 version. This one moves so fast! It's the shortest version of this section by a full minute. We see Jane waiting to go to her aunt and being rudely ignored by her cousins, and then we cut straight to Mrs. Reed telling Jane that she's twice done her wrong. Wow, it just flies! Mrs. Reed alleges that Jane cursed her, which is a little different, and maybe this happened because they were hurrying, or maybe it was the mood they were going for, but there's something more desperate about the rapid, whispered delivery of the lines here, especially Jane's, "I would have loved you if you'd let me." Jane kind of steels herself and then tells her aunt she forgives her. It sounds almost like the conclusion of a business transaction. She then exits the room, and the section ends with Jane's voiceover writing a letter to her uncle informing him that she's alive and well and living at Thornfield Hall. That's a different take, a shortcut I don't mind too much. So those are all the major adaptations, interpretations of Jane's return to Gateshead and reunion with her sick aunt. It's the usual collection of hits and misses, but nothing too crazy in the mix. I guess I like 1983's version of the scene with the aunt best overall. That was predictable. But 2006 includes more of the book's content. It does have some things that are not in the book sandwiched in there, but it has some stuff that no other adaptation has included before, and more importantly, I do prefer Jane's delivery of the forgiveness line there. Now I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know what you think of this particular scene and the adaptations of it in the comments below if you like. I have every intention of doing the next one of these as soon as possible. We'll see. I was looking at my plan for the adaptation comparisons, and I think it's possible that we could finish this project this year. I hope you enjoyed this adaptation comparison, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching!